Hello and welcome to another episode of Page Burners. We work our way through the Malazan books in publication order. We just finished our read through of Deadhouse Gates. We're reading them about 100 pages every week. We will start Memories of Ice next week. But meanwhile, to celebrate the completion of Deadhouse Gates, we have a very special guest with us. Mr. Erikson, how are you today? We're really grateful to have you on the podcast.
Well, thanks for the invitation. I'm doing well. Looking forward to this.
Awesome. And with me, of course, we have the usual gang who will maybe go around and introduce themselves, maybe just so to remind everyone who else is on here. Jared, could you start us off?
Sure. I'm Jared. I run a Fancy Thinker YouTube cast here on Page Chewing.
I'm Carl. I feature pretty much exclusively here as a little frequent guest and occasionally on speculations. But otherwise, I got a book out, Truth of Crowns. You can go check it out. But, that's not why you're here. You're here for the man himself. All right, Dan, I'll pass it off to you.
Yeah, I'm Dan. I don't have any podcast like these guys. I'm just a reader of other people's words and a sayer of my own words, I guess, but never a writer of my own words. And yeah, I'm part of this podcast and the speculative speculation one.
Very nice.
Steve?
Steve, yes.
Yeah, I'm Steve from Steve Talks Books and Page Chewing. Find me on pagechewing.com and happy to be here. And Shannon.
And I'm Shannon, and I'm also of Page Chewing here and a speaker of my own words only.
Not even a reader of words like that. Okay. So, like I said in the introduction, and to I think to Mr. Erikson, just to introduce you to our podcast, we are reading about 100 pages every week, and we accumulated some questions as we made our way through Gardens of the Moon and Deadhouse Gates. Carl, do you want to start off with one of yours?
Sure. Well, my first, do you have a way in these sort of conversational interviews like to be referred to? Do you prefer Mr. Erikson, Steven, Steve?
Steve's fine. Yeah.
Steve. Okay, great. Perfect. All right, Steve. Well, I'm going to hit you with a really hard-hitting one first, which what the hell is up with that massacre at the start of Gardens of the Moon? And I guess we should say full spoilers for the first two books. Nowhere after it and anything else. But this massacre in particular was one that we have debated a lot. Like, what's going on there? Obviously, it leads to Sari getting possessed.
Mm-hmm.
But we were struggling to kind of wrap our heads around the motivation of Catillian and Shadow Throne and what they're trying to do there. Is it just like vengeance against
No.
the Empire that in some ways betrayed them, or what? Yeah,
No.
can you speak to that?
It's obfuscation more than anything else. Basically, in order to cover the trail of the possession of Sari, they wanted to create as much chaos in that region as possible, so that she could possibly sort of slip under the rails and in a clandestine fashion position herself. That's Catillian possessing her where she needs to be, and so that's primarily what it's all about. Of course, it fails ultimately, but that's the effort.
Okay, so they go there with the intent of plucking Sari from this little village. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Well, that clarifies that.
Yeah, I thought that was a side effect of what they came there to do, which is to release the dogs, but it was actually the other way around.
It's the other way around, yeah.
Interesting. And was it Sari they specifically had in mind, or was it anybody they could possess?
Probably anybody, but she seemed anonymous enough. She was not already in the military and was pretty isolated. So in that sense, arriving as a stranger, there's no background, there's no history behind where she's come from. So it's that anonymity that actually Catillian is dependent upon.
I think we were confused about it in the sense, like we were discussing about it a lot, because it kind of seems like the subterfuge goes away immediately, like the junk gets there, and she's like, well, there's something suspicious here, and they sort of quite quickly, at least in the timeline of the book, figure out that she's in the bridge burners, and they send people to deal with her and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, it fails. It's recognized that that there's no real reason for that mayhem and that chaos and the slaughter. And I mean, I was hoping that there'd be enough clues in the narrative. Certainly when Saris shows up with the so-called muddy feet with the recruiting officer, that should have been, I hoped, a good indication of sort of where she's come from. Yeah.
Very cool. All right. Well, that clarifies that long time mystery.
So you're only 2 books in. None of you have read further?
A number of us have read the whole series.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know. All right.
There are some of us have only read a handful of the books. I think we've all read at least the first 4. Is that right? Although for this podcast, we're keeping it to just the first 2.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be reading Esselmont's books as well, which I've actually read a number of and am reading one of right now. But the plan is to, like, over time, get through everything.
Cool. Okay.
Farshid, or whoever's next. I don't know. Who wants to take it from there?
I had one while we were talking about character motivations from the first book. I was curious about what Opon wanted to do as well, because did they just want to generally sow chaos? They were interesting as participants in the scheming that went on in the first book. But was their intention to just not let anything in particular happen, not let any particular god win, or did they have a specific end goal that they were working towards too?
No particular end goal. I mean, that's the whole thing about chance, right? It's that random player, which is introduced in order to mess up the plans of the other gods, and that's kind of the nature of their mischief. Is almost kind of a meta approach to their fellow gods in the pantheon. If they can mess them up and foil their plans, they will do so, and that's how they get their kicks.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because it did feel strange for gods of chance to try for specific motivations, but that could just be the motivation of sowing chaos.
Yeah, they like being the wild card. That's kind of their purpose.
Did anyone else have one that we can sow in, or we can work our way through the list?
I had one just kind of in general. To write such a long and complex story, to have your work out there, and to have, there's so many communities and groups of people like us who read through the books and who pick apart every little thing and want to know, have answers. What does that feel like for you? For all these years later, there's still people picking up the first few books and reading the series. What is that like to have so many huge communities that go through and question every little thing and get attached to characters and experience it so many years later?
Yeah, I mean, it continues to astonish me that there appears to be, at least so far, a decent shelf life to the series. I mean, it was written sort of with that hope in mind, and so that's why there's so much rereadability built into the narrative and the plot. But quite often, it can be a little bit intimidating because my memory is what it is, and suddenly we're talking about stuff that I wrote, 25 years ago, or even longer. And I honestly, I'd have to have the book in hand quite often to answer certain questions. So far, I mean, these have been nicely general, so they're okay. But if you were to get really specific about something happening on page 251 or something, I mean, I can't help you on that one. So it's just, yeah, I guess now I look back on it, and I do have a sense of distance regarding it, which is probably useful in terms of being able to respond to specific questions, knowing that there is a much broader tale behind it all, which I can't reveal. So that's been kind of helpful. I know early on when I did some interviews, I might have dropped something that I shouldn't have mentioned. So these days I'm kind of better at that. I've had more practice.
Sure, it's fine. Nobody listens to this anyways, so.
Yeah, me too.
Fine.
Me too. Yeah.
We have a specific goal here with this podcast that we want to ruin the ways in which ordinary people interact with others online. People create these parasocial relationships, and we want to be the inoculation against that. So by listening to us, they'll hate us so much that actually they'll realize all people are not worth creating these unhealthy one-sided relationships with. So I think it's a really noble pursuit, and I'm happy to have you as part of it now. You are part of it now, by the way.
It sounds good. Yeah, very noble.
Join us in our obscurity. Sorry, go ahead, Dan.
Oh, I had a question follow up what Steve was asking, sort of. When you were saying about, well, you're starting to forget some of the minute details of all the different things that you wrote a while ago. What's your feeling/approach about people interpreting things in your books in a different way than maybe you intended? Or maybe they think, oh, I think this part means this, or they have their own canon of what it meant.
I mean, that is the right of the reader to take what's written and interpret it as they will. The role of the writer is to try to narrow those interpretive options as much as possible. You're basically trying to guide the reader to conclusions or to interpretations that you intend. But you have to recognize that you don't have absolute control over that. And so once the work is out there, once it's reaching its audience, a lot of that is out of your hands. So, and that's what sort of puts pressure on the writing of the narrative itself, the book itself, is that you have to actually, or I feel I have to be conscious of creating scenes, characters, plot lines that are not flawed in such a fashion that it leads the reader astray. If that makes any sense, and that's kind of part of the discipline, I guess, of just writing a story, to make sure that that you're not sort of creating subtext that you don't want, or that you're implying certain things, or you're creating almost an unseen agenda that sits beneath everything. So for me, I'm always conscious of as much balance as I can possibly achieve. And one of the ways of doing that is to adhere strictly to the point of view character that you're writing in, so that this is their point of view, this is their world, this is how they interpret things, this is their worldview, and that's going to manifest itself and express itself in various ways depending on the nature of the character. So by holding to that, I can sort of keep the personal aspects of me at once removed from the story, and therefore invisible.
Oh.
Speaking of that point of view, I think somebody had a question about the refugees and the rebel perspectives in Deadhouse Gates. I don't know who put that up there, but most of the perspective is not from their point of view. Most of it's from either the Malazans or the Chain of Dogs or what have you. And who was it that put that question up there?
I think it might have been Carl.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead, Dan.
We have discussed it a couple of times because we noticed a couple of times that the rebels were portrayed in a very negative way at all points, pretty much of it, like the massacre and all the brutality against civilians and et cetera, et cetera. And we thought it was interesting because usually these type of stories with a rebellion against a colonial empire are told in a favorable way from the rebelling people's standpoint. But we really haven't seen anything too much about the Malazan Empire treating the people badly, and everything we're seeing is from the Malazan standpoint, and it seems like they're the good guys, I guess. So we thought it was interesting.
Yeah. One of the things that sort of it might be helpful to bear in mind is that if you sort of sense a particular stance or point of view that's not being explored, look for a parallel somewhere in the text. And what I mean by that is you're looking at refugees. So what you're looking at is somebody driven from their familiar environment, their home, and pushed to great extremes that alters their behavior and traumatizes them. So is there a character in Deadhouse Gates that carries all of that? And the answer would be Felicin. Yeah. So that's the stand-in, right? So otherwise you're looking at, if you're going to write sort of from every angle, every perspective and all the rest, a fairly long book becomes an insanely long book, right? So one of the ways to do this is you focus on particular characters that can carry thematically some of that other stuff that you're not going to. If I were to start really going into some of the refugee characters on the Chain of Dogs, well, that's a whole new point of view. That's a whole new narrative that has to be sewn into the storyline. And there was plenty there to begin with. And I really wanted, because I was using Duiker as the point of view, I wanted to focus on that side of things. And in a sense, he begins certainly as a refugee, so he is bridging the two. So he carries a bit of that point of view, that perspective. But in this case, it is certainly you would look to Felicin for the thematic connection with the refugees. And recognizing her trauma, one would hope, would give you a sense of the trauma of the refugees themselves and how self-protective they are, which can turn into sort of bad decisions being made and all the rest. Does that make sense?
That's great. I definitely see what you're doing there. And I also think, one of the things I love about this series is that the way the themes and even down to the actual conflicts recur in slightly different variations over the course of the series. And there are definitely other plot lines later on that I do feel like speak to this sort of similar story without getting into too many details. So that's awesome. On the note of your intent and what is conscious versus what is subconscious for you as a writer, this is something that's really interesting to me because I look up to you a lot. I'm a young writer, like trying to make all this stuff happen, and it always surprises me when someone will read something and be like, have an interpretation of something that I did not expect or intend, but maybe is richer actually even than what I intended, and other things that I tried really hard to dig in there, and I'm like, this is really deep and complex, and no one notices it, and I'm like, oh yeah, okay, well, that's for me, I guess. There was a reading that I had this time through Deadhouse Gates, which was of Icarium himself as this sort of characterization or this symbol for humanity at large, and that his sort of existence is embodying the moral quandary of humanity as when we keep making the same mistakes over and over again, and yet we have this ignorance and naivete and compassion inside us, but also this capability for immense violence and genocide, that we are seeing reawakened, many places in the world today, right now. And so was that intentional? Or was I reading too much into things? Or
No. It's remember, everything's sort of linked to everything else. So if you think of Duiker as the disaffected historian, okay, so this is a person who's been educated in uh, in that sense of deep time running through civilizations and cultures, but as witness to something that is happening in the here and now that it eventually engulfs him and he becomes immersed in. So, so history is going to be a major topic of subtextual discussion or exploration. And so another facet of that, of course, with fantasy, you can take a metaphor and make it real. So Icarium basically is that. He is that concept of the loss of knowledge through time, and how that often triggers a repetition of behaviors equally destructive as the first time around or the second time around and all the rest. But there's a reset that keeps occurring. And I guess a lot of that comes back to sort of my experiences as an archaeologist and excavating sites of cultures that no longer are present, at least in the form that they were back then. And so, yeah, you get a sense of there are elements of repetition in terms of behavior, technologies, engagement with the environment, and all the rest. But at the same time, there's this vast question mark. There's this huge blank that you just can't answer. And so Icarium is very much that. And the violent element, it kind of ties into the notion of with sufficient stress, all sort of civil comportment breaks down, and you get anarchy. And he embodies anarchy with his violence. And yeah, it tends to break everything down. So it's that notion of, if you don't like your world, rather than try to survive it, you simply destroy it, and as if that were somehow the solution. So yeah, characters are going to carry on, and they're going to shoulder those particular themes, and sort of once they're in place, then you can start exploring it and deconstructing it and messing around with it for sure.
Was that the genesis of the idea for Icarium, or was he a character you gamed and kind of found your way into that?
No,
okay.
No, it's not gamed. It was, he was invented on the page. And the opening scene with him and Mappo, I had really no idea who they were. Yeah, so I just sort of created this scene with these two characters, and then I thought, well, what can I do with them? And that's where some of the backstory I realized I could plug into these two characters, and they could carry those elements forward. I mean, for me, I always had a sense that the Malazan world was so big from the gaming that I would need stand-ins to sort of pick up some of those storylines and carry it forward. And then it was a question of choosing choosing which characters were going to carry what. And Icarium and Mappo certainly carried forward that sense of the cyclical patterns or evolution of civilizations. So and that's why he's obsessed with time, right? So
is he right? Exactly. All the symbols. That was one of the things we noticed was the ways the symbolism itself like all comes together to those themes. So am I correct then in understanding that you just had this like image, these two just kind of characters, as a broad swath, and you wrote it out and then figured out who they were and what their story was and where they're going to go from there?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the opening scene, if I remember correctly, and I'm pretty sure I do, they're looking at what looks like a dust devil down on the plain. And that's kind of the image that starts. And if you think about it, when I talk about elliptical writing, and I look for in the opening first few sentences of a section, I look for sort of a central visual or an image, anything. Could be built into the setting, or it could be something else. But anyways, and it rings a bell. And what that bell actually refers to is, well, okay, they're looking at a dust devil. What is a dust devil? Well, it's this sort of chaotic spiral of sort of a vortex of wind that is actually ripping everything up from the ground. and it seems to move randomly across the landscape. Well, that absolutely fits with Icarium, right? That's precisely what he is, in a sense, doing. So that rang that bell, and then once I had that in my mind, then I realized that I could build from that, and make sure that that opening scene feeds into who Icarium is, and who Mappo will be. So yeah, it's part of that writing process. I guess I learned really on with short story writing is on that first draft, you want to keep your radar up for those images and those little details that you can then later work with that have resonance in this sense, or the potential of resonance anyways. And then you can work with those.
Absolutely. That's awesome. Thank you.
So, Icarium really made me think about Shiva, the god of destruction.
Yeah,
Did that play a role in the creation of Icarium, the way he brings things to a complete end? Or
sure, absolutely. I mean, that notion of the necessity for both creation and destruction, that the two require each other. So much of the Malazan stuff touches on that sense of balance, and that having sort of an absolute domination of one side over versus the other is usually prelude to complete destruction, anyways, or breakdown. So yeah, there's that sense of balance that runs all the way through.
nice. And sorry, we talked about some very nice things about Icarium, but I have kind of a silly question. Is that I know the name sounds a lot like Icarus, the kid who flew too close to the sun. Is that
No,
does
I
that
don't think
aspect
so.
play a role in the name at
No,
all? No.
no, I don't think so. My naming conventions are kind of weird. They bubble up.
Hmm.
They're sort of like foam rising on the surface of the imagination, and if something about it is flavorful, then I'll pluck it up and put it on the page. So Karium certainly, yeah, I probably invented that name right there on the page with that opening scene. Mappo, I think, might have been a rolled up character at one point, but never played. I'm not sure. I think I rolled up a trail character at one point.
Nice.
Who were the characters we were saying last time we met, but they had very similar names? And we were, who was it?
There were a few. There's a lot of names starting with
Malik
K
Rel,
in
Ralik
yeah,
Nom.
that too.
Yeah.
Who else? There were
There's
some of those.
another
I
couple
always say
characters.
the wrong one.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's probably there's gonna be some continuity in the way I sort of construct some of those names. Sometimes I would tie it to specific cultures, so that one area of 7 cities would have a certain kind of naming convention. Bacchus would have a different one. Darujhistan might have a different one. But I didn't really sort of strictly adhere to all of that. I did want a sense of, and this is one of the things that people often, well, in the study of history, at least when I was at university and studying it, there was a very kind of unspoken sensibility, if you will, that ancient cultures were fairly isolated. There may have been trade, there may have been some, people's crossing over and all the rest. But I guess what wasn't there was the fullest recognition of just how mobile we are as a species. And it's taken a lot of more recent advances in archaeology to really hammer that home, that people have been moving great distances. And we're getting that because, archaeologists are now getting that because they're able to determine DNA and genome patterns and all the rest, quite often just from soil, in a cave. So that kind of technical advancement in really being able to map humanity's movement geographically and through time has kind of opened up that, or rather dismantled that old notion of these fixed, static civilizations that only had sort of official avenues of communication and trade, usually from the top down. It seems like that's not the case, and that people were traveling and moving all over the place. So in the Malazan world, yeah, you'll get blendings of naming styles that run across multiple continents, and especially with the Malazan Empire expanding, it's bringing those people all out there anyways. Not just soldiers, but sailors who jump ship and end up somewhere else, trade, all the rest. So the other thing that I applied for naming conventions was messing around with the number of syllables in first name and second name in terms of what becomes more memorable. I look at my family and my parents who clearly believed in brevity, naming me Steve and my brother Kent. So one syllable and then two syllables for the last name, London. And I think that was quite conventional, at least coming out of Sweden at that time. And so for the creating a fantasy world, it made sense for me to maybe flip that on occasion. And the two examples you gave of Malacrel and Malaknam, yeah, I mean it's flipped. But then also I also drew a lot on Sanskrit stuff and that wonderful rhythmic naming convention like Anamander is that kind of stuff. It's very much drawn from Indo-European Sanskrit stuff.
Were your parents immigrants?
Mm-hmm.
Just catching on to something there. Oh, cool. Didn't know that. Very cool.
Since you brought up Anamander, Rig, I had a question about him. So I've read all 10 books, and I've listened to a lot of your interviews, and I think one thing that stood out to me was you talked about how it was difficult to write Riks' perspective, or at least since he is so long-lived, it was hard to get inside of his head. I might be paraphrasing what you said, but
Mm-hmm.
but there are correspondingly, I think, some Telanimas perspectives, for instance, and they are similarly, at least on a scale perspective, long-lived. So I was curious what made the Imas doable, that made Rik, or what was different about Rik, or what was easy about the Imas?
Good question.
Yeah.
I think because of the cultural framework of Telanimas, because I was modeling that on what I knew about and what I suspected was going to be found out about Neanderthal culture, right? So they're basically Neanderthals. And so, having that academic background of studying those things, I felt quite comfortable. If I were to sort of go into a point of view of a Telanimas, recognizing that the ritual created these certain effects, and you won't get that until obviously Memories of Ice. But where they were coming from was going to feel familiar for me. It would be gathering, hunting, nomadic, maybe seasonally nomadic, small band of people, being able, having basically mobile technology, nothing they would leave behind. So all of that felt very familiar to me, because that's kind of where my archaeology had taken me anyways. And I'd been out on, the prairies, unbroken prairie, and that environment is not too different, I would think. Well, I'm fairly certain it isn't, from far north tundra environment. And so even the environments were familiar to me. And I'd been to enough sort of ancient kill sites and all the rest in that area to also get a sense of hunting patterns and all the rest. So getting a Telanimas point of view was not difficult. But Anamander Rake, I mean, the Teist, at the time especially, the Teist Andi were an alien civilization. So alien sensibilities. Not only that, I can't give too much away, but their blood is not pure. There's the blood of other things. So that is a very different sensibility. And secondly, Here's the other thing: it was just entirely accidental because I tried Anamander's point of view, and then for those reasons, I chose not to use it. And then that had an unexpected side effect, which was that for the reader, Anamander became very elevated. I mean, much more a character of focus than I anticipated. So I realized that there's this connection between the two, right? You hold that character at a distance, they are uplifted, if you will. And then, so when I got to Deadhouse Gates, I thought, okay, I can really work with that because I can do that to Coltane. And so again, it elevates that character. But when I'm writing a point of view of a Talana mass, what I'm actually trying to do is not elevate. I'm trying to bring them to eye level, so that we connect with them. We have an emotional connection with them, despite the fact that they're undead corpses walking around that can turn to dust. So it's a different imperative, and that would be one of the reasons why I would choose that point of view of a Talana mass and use it to create empathy and connection with the reader. Whereas Anamander Rake, once I discovered that this was really effective to keep him at a distance, that was I was going to follow that rule.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of taking your background and your point of view, and maybe this is a question for you as well as Cam, something that really stood out to me was that the Malazan Empire seems to be a very secular empire in terms of like its governing structure. And when I think of empires in our world historically, they're often associated with divinity, right? The empire or emperor, empress is often holy in some way, often a god or related to the gods, things like that. And so it seemed like that must have been a very intentional choice. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to that.
Sure. I think one of the issues is, if you were to think of the Roman Empire, generally people think of the imperial period of the Roman Empire, and that's sort of where the emperors started showing up. And at a certain point, those emperors would proclaim divinity upon themselves, and but that was all part of a much broader structural breakdown of governance in the Roman Empire. But from the Gracchi earlier, you're looking at the Republic. And during the time of the Republic of the Roman Empire, religious freedom was absolute. It was, there was no, there may be a pantheon of Roman gods, but when new areas were taken over, quite often some of those gods were actually incorporated into the pantheon of the original Roman stuff. And of course, the Roman stuff isn't original anyway, so it's Greek. So there must have been a sense at the time that you had quite limited ownership over these belief systems, even as the Republic of Rome. So that's kind of what we were thinking of. We were thinking a bit more, and there were other examples. I mean, there was a period in maybe 8th to the 10th century in Constantinople, Byzantium, that had extraordinary religious and cultural and ethnic freedoms. Something that we almost don't even see to this day. So there are examples out there, and that's kind of what we were looking for.
Well, in this book, we find out, that Kellanved and Dancer became gods in this book. Is that do you find that ironic that the Roman emperors proclaim themselves gods, but these guys had to leave to do it?
I don't know about ironic. I mean, it was almost accidental on their part.
Okay.
They were pursuing something, and you'd have to read Knight of Knives, Cam's book, to get a better sense of at least a moment of that breakaway from the empire they created. But a lot of that was a consequence of the campaigns that we gamed. It pulled in that direction, as most role-playing games is all about sort of powering up your characters, and so that's that notion that we then applied as ascendancy in the Malazan world. So yeah, the more Cam played Kellenbed, or as he was back then, Dr. Wu. And my NPC for that was Dancer. So the more he played that, the more powerful he got, and the more ambitious he got, and it just sort of ballooned from there.
I had a follow-up question about religion in, I guess, this world. Because every time I read a fantasy book and there's, real gods in that universe, I think about, how would society be if it was real proof of the existence of gods? Wouldn't everyone just all the time be basically worshipping them or following what they say or stuff like that? I guess we don't see that much in these books, but we also don't see much about the perspective of normal people, because this is all like people that are always interfacing with gods or supernatural things. Is that just something that normal people don't really encounter much of this proof of real gods? So it's kind of similar to our situation.
Oh man, I'd have to give you a really long answer for that one. The nature of the relationship between divinity, and a mortal is explored throughout the entire series, and I go back to it repeatedly. And so, if you were to think in the real world setting, if a god were to manifest, what would be sort of the range of responses to that? And that that range is immense. So yes, you might have your average person on the street who just doesn't give a shit, right? The god showed up, what's it going to do for me? And they just get on with their lives. And then you may have somebody who says, well, if I sacrifice this goat, or if I go to the temple 3 times a week or 7 times a week or whatever, and do all these propitiations and show, I guess, allegiance, respect, reverence, adoration, whatever you want to call it, worship, then the god will reward me. But that's an assumption that doesn't even include whether the god's interested in rewarding all of that stuff or not, right? So there may be no efficacy to doing that anyways, in which case, why are you going? Well, you may be going now for secular reasons, that you're joining a whole bunch of like-minded people, and that needs to be organized, and there's potential to move up in the ranks and acquire more influence or whatever. So that could be one of your motivations, in which case it's got nothing to do with the god, right? So there's so many different ways to respond to a phenomenon like that, and in the Malazan world, and certainly how Cam and I played it and talked about it, and then wrote about it. We were certainly conscious of the fact that it can be played in a multitude of ways, and let's explore as many of them as possible.
I guess there isn't as much. There's not a lot of god worship, at least in the books I've read. I haven't read everything. It's more like the gods are just like people, but a lot more powerful, sort of. Right?
Yeah, there's a lot of sort of the pantheon landscape that you got in the Iliad. And that, I mean, the Iliad was quite important in how we visualized the engagement of gods. And so even demigods, I mean, our version of that was just ascendancy, an ascendant persona was a demigod. And so then when you then go to the Iliad and you start reading that for the purpose of determining or deconstructing the nature of that relationship, it gets very strange very quickly. So yeah, it's but at the same time, well, maybe not at the same time, but that strangeness is actually really intriguing because of the implications in terms of that relationship between the physical manifest world around us and that which is unknown and potentially unknowable. And so that that's that gets more interesting. And then, if the gods are participatory in some sense, even there, you may be able to parse the motivations of a particular action by a god. But that doesn't mean you actually figure out exactly what it's up to or what it's intending. So again, you're left open to the vagaries of and the whims of a very powerful being. And my sense would be you would try to travel through your world keeping your head down, for obvious reasons. And so a lot of the presence of gods could also encourage people to not look up and to basically try to live as quietly as possible.
Very different approach than the, I guess, Abrahamic religion approach that is most permeating our society, right?
Yeah, it's definitely very different relationship. I mean, some of that's explored in the books as well. Ones that are related to a very close-knit, tight cultural and religious identity. Absolutely.
I think there was a line from Guardians of the Moon that we discussed. We always have quotes at the end of our episodes, but one of them was, "A quiet life, the best life is one lived out of the view of the gods." And so kind of just followed up with.
Yeah.
Shannon, did you? I realized I don't think you asked the question yet. Is there something you wanted?
I'm good. I'll if one occurs to me, I'll ask it. Right now, I'm enjoying just listening to everybody else's.
Alrighty. Well, we got a number of interesting questions here. I guess for one, I know we talked about as a group. It's actually not in that list, but how do you decide on the structure of each of the individual books? Like some are in 4 acts, some are in 7 acts. And how do you determine, where one act ends and another begins, things like that? Because they definitely don't always strike me as like the traditional. Your books are paced in ways that I don't feel like are often untraditional, with the exception being that there's a big climax at the end, although even that you subvert sometimes. So could you speak to how you structure these books?
Well, first of all, Gardens of the Moon, the convention employed in Gardens of the Moon was one I immediately abandoned with the rest of the series. Right? So the 7 books is an anomaly, if you will, structurally. And quite often, the deciding points for those 7 books related to shifts in setting, sometimes quite large ones, or shifts in which side was actually going to be explored, whether the people of Darujhistan versus the bridge burners, or versus adjunct lore and traveling in the landscape and all the rest. So all of those things helped sort of create that kind of breaking up of various sections in Gardens of the Moon. But eventually, I think I fell back onto a 4-part shift, 4 parts to each novel. I'm pretty sure I'm consistent. That may change. I haven't looked, but I don't know if The Crippled God has more than 4 parts. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it
but
does.
It does? Yeah. Well, I figured by then I needed to tip the hat to the original series, because I had a strong sense of wanting to wrap things on sort of every level. But generally, yeah, I defaulted to a 4-part breakup of each novel. And I don't know what the decision making, probably just length alone, would have decided in many cases when I was going to end book 1 and start book 2 within the novel. But at the same time, as I've talked about a lot over the years, I began as a short story writer, and in a sense, this 10-book series is the world's longest short story, because that's how I wrote it. And I wrote, each scene is on some level a kind of a self-contained short story. and then each section, and then each chapter, and then it just sort of builds from there. So, yeah, I guess that's not, or rather, it's atypical for your normal novelist, because I never really sort of, I guess I never really applied what I'd read in novels to what I was writing. I applied what I'd learned as a short story writer to what I was writing. So.
That's very interesting, because uh, I come from a film background. I went to film school, and so was really hammered with like 3-act Hollywood structure. And so my first book, I was trying to avoid that at all costs, and I ended up actually wandering to an older structure, the kind of, although Shakespeare didn't even write it in this way, the 5 acts that he has since been his plays are put into, which worked out because it was a tragedy, just structurally, and also emotionally as I was writing it. But yeah, that's very interesting. I see how how your background informs the way you decide to structure it at the most basic level.
Yeah, I mean, Cam and I started as script writers as well, and quite often we'd end up cheating, right? It would be 4 acts, it wouldn't be 3. But we tried really hard to stay under the 3-act sort of formatting. But as soon as we got to the novels, I know both Cam and I, we just threw that out the window. You know, we were not interested in following even Freytag's pyramid. I mean, it just didn't interest us. And the 3 acts, yeah, it's comfortable, I guess, but probably more comfortable for a viewing audience rather than a reading one. I think a reading one is a lot more open to a bit more structural meandering and wandering. So
Jurassic Park is 4 acts, so you're in good company.
So when I read, I tend to forget a lot of what I read. Like my favorite books, I'll never remember how they end or even parts of it, just that I do enjoy them. But from the Malazan book of the Fallen, however, there are so many things that I remember in such great detail. And also there are images that sort of stand out to me. I'm also not a visual reader at all. I don't imagine things as I go. There are images that stand out to me, like some in Deadhouse Gates, for instance, the cylinder with all the Testandi and the dragon coming to the rescue, or not really. But so I was wondering if why that is. I've been trying to diagnose why I remember the Malazan Book of the Fallen so much better than anything else I've read. And I was wondering if there's some conscious effort you put in to write these memorable images or things that tend to, and there's no repetition in what you write, right? So I just tend to remember, oh, this came up a few books before. So is it something you do to remind your readers without really repeating yourself?
well, I write visually. Okay, so basically, on one level, anyways, I'm writing a film that I'm shooting as we go. And so, in terms of setting description, in terms of action description, I'm basically choreographing it as best I can. So if I were to, an exchange, a sword fight between 2 characters, I would make use of my background as a fencer for decades. I would apply some of that in terms of footwork, distancing, all that kind of stuff, timing. But I would choreograph it and make sure that it made sense visually. And yeah, again, for the big scenes, I mean, one has to sort of, you don't want to repeat yourself in a sense. You want to come up with new ways of describing old things, or new ways of describing things that have never been seen before, at least in the writer's memory, and the writer's, rather than stealing a scene from previous work of fiction, some other author. It's much more challenging and more fun to come up with something that you don't think has been out there, has been done before. And so, because that sort of gives you that sense of originality to what you're doing, which means also ownership, which means responsibility. So they're all connected. Because I'm writing visually and I'm trying to describe what I'm seeing in my head, what my imagination has conjured, then it's just an exercise of being as precise as possible, so that the reader gets an idea of what's going on as clearly as possible. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, and that's very effective because even though I don't read visually, I have so many images from the series that just live in my head.
The
Yeah, I mean,
fan artists love it.
often I would have even a musical soundtrack sitting behind it.
Hmm.
I'd have headphones on. I wrote most of the series listening to music. Often, well, I tended not to write. I could not write listening to just instrumental.
Hmm.
So classical, I would just sit there and stare off out through the window, because I'd just be listening to it. And I know it sounds really counterintuitive, but I needed good lyrics, like really well written poetic lyrics.
Interesting.
And that would inspire me because, like I say, the perfectly written line in a song that's just pure inspiration for me, because I love language, and so to see it done and to listen to it done well, just fires me up.
Yeah, that that's really interesting too. That I've heard you say that in another interview, and I was always curious about how that worked because when I write code, I like to listen to music, and I cannot have lyrics because it
Mm.
intrudes on my thoughts.
Hmm.
So I was surprised that when you're writing, which does involve actual words, not made up code words, that it doesn't intrude on your thought process that
No,
much.
probably if it was brand new, like something I
Hmm.
hadn't heard before, no, I
Hmm.
couldn't do that. It has to be something I grew up with, something I'm so intimately familiar with and have heard countless times,
Hmm.
so that it doesn't intrude on sort of the active conscious creation level of thinking when you're
Hmm.
composing something. So it's almost subliminal. It sits behind me. I mean, there's a line in Roger Waters' albums, one of his songs, in Amused to Death is the name of the album. And it's just about, I think, some hyenas streaming down a hillside. It's just such an evocative line. It sort of comes out of nowhere. Um, and that one shows up in, I think, a multitude of times in Deadhouse Gates in one form or another.
Hmm.
So, in terms of temporality, that's telling you that I was writing that, I guess, when that album was out, or at least when I was listening to it a lot. So I can kind of connect things that way.
Nice.
Yeah.
Steve, do you got a question?
Yes.
Yeah, something that we've discussed, and they're coming for Dan again. They found him. Something that we had discussed during all the books, but something I didn't really notice the first time through the series is how funny it is, and all the humor that's in the books. Do you take us behind the curtain when you're writing these more humorous scenes? Are you there laughing to yourself, or like what are those scenes like? Because it's especially like one character that comes to mind is the crone. How funny the crone is, and it's. Do you insert humor intentionally to break up kind of the tension and the seriousness, or is that something that you just drop in?
No, I don't just drop it in. It needs to certainly have a function, have a purpose. Using Crone as the example, her humor sort of represents an irreverence for the situation, and given the company she keeps, given how powerful that company is, that irreverence counterbalances the potential for melodrama on the other side, right? You kind of unplugging the sort of the cliched heavy bass beats of these other characters, and if you sense that they're getting too solemn, too self-absorbed, too serious about things, then a character like Crone can help sort of dismantle and diffuse some of that stuff. So yeah, a lot of that kind of humor is it's also a commentary on the tropes of the genre as well. So I often use the humor to dismantle some of those tropes, and that happens a lot in Gardens of the Moon, perhaps more there than almost anywhere else. Because a lot of the purpose of writing that novel was to do just that, which is to set up the tropes and then kick them down. So, I mean, for me, one of the classic examples is Crocus not getting the girl. Everything is set up for him to get the girl, and it just doesn't happen. And so I find that stuff amusing, and I'll write to build that reveal, and have fun doing that. But a lot of what the humor reflects is my nostalgic memories of Cam and I gaming, because it would be, very comedic. And we'd game, for the purposes of entertaining each other, but also making each other laugh. And for the longest time, maybe for the whole series, more consciously to begin with, but always present, was that sense that I was writing these novels with Cam as my first audience. And so if I can make him laugh, then I was doing a good job, and vice versa. I've talked to him about it. He did the same thing. He was writing the stuff for me, and I was writing the stuff for him. And we, fingers were crossed that somebody else would actually enjoy what they were reading.
That's lovely. I think something that's so special about comedy is that, and this is true in real life, but I definitely find it's true in fiction as well. I think I see this in Malazan, and you'd see this again, to reference Shakespeare again, with often his fools. You can speak truth, through comedy, and it is much easier to process. It doesn't feel so preachy, if it's through someone who's also making a fart joke at the same time, right? And so it's so important, and I think does serve narratively a dramatic function on top, and a thematic function on top of just being there for shits and giggles, literally. Although certainly that is lovely, as someone who is in a long time D&D campaign, you just have to laugh, right? Like, it's especially even if you're dealing with like dark shit, why not? You're with your friends, right? Why not be goofy when one of you is like trying to seduce someone and it goes horribly wrong, like.
Yeah. And I mean, for us, it's not just in the gaming scenario. It was in the archaeology digs we were on together, and apart as well. I mean, you're with a crew, maybe 6 or 7, 8 other people, and most of the digs, with a few exceptions, that I worked on were in pretty remote places, and so we'd be in the bush basically 10 days on, 4 days off. So 4 days back to, we'd go back to Winnipeg or wherever we nearest city. And over the course of a summer, because back then excavations were all summer, funding issues were less problematic than they are now. But we would, it's almost as if sort of the civilized trappings are slowly stripped away, and you really get to know your fellow workers. But quite often, if the environment is challenging, and I mean, living in a tent, beside a lake sounds pretty idyllic, but it can also be pretty challenging. But then if you're working on a dig that's running over time, it's running into the fall, and the weather's getting just horrendous, and you're stuck in ATCO trailers, and you're having to break through the ice to wash your face in the mornings, and that kind of stuff.
Oh,
There's a really, something happens psychologically to people in that kind of isolation.
You literally break the ice.
Yeah, and you can go either way. So, I've seen people do the Jack Torrance thing, the Shining style of cabin fever, and yeah, there are stories. There was a couple of digs that were adjacent to. I was working Western Manitoba while some things were going absolutely apeshit in a project in Eastern Manitoba, which I heard about later. So And then I had somebody who came after me with a hatchet in one project because and this is the point, is that you can either go that way or everything is a joke, right? You're just hamming it up constantly, and you don't take anything seriously. It's absolutely absurd, and you're just out there for laughs. And so, yeah, in that instance, I was out there for laughs, and one guy didn't like the joke, and so he came after me. So it's just, and so when we write humor, and especially when we write squad-based humor, we're remembering those times. We're remembering that camaraderie and the hardships and the closeness of those crews because of that level of isolation. And yeah, quite often, somebody on that crew would be acting pretty weird by the end of the summer, and you just either live with it or whatever. Sometimes I was the one acting pretty weird by the end of the summer. And so, yeah, so writing that kind of stuff, it's not too dissimilar to, say, the television series MASH, right? It's a horrendous situation, and yet it's comedic because that's their escape valve. That's their way out of the scenario they're in. And so made use of that a lot.
This is a very distinct and uniquely humorous character. I was wondering if you could talk about his origins and why he is the way he is. I love him as a character. I think he's brilliant. But I was curious about how you came up with him.
How did I come up with him? I guess he's kind of a counterpoint to Krupp. So with Krupp, Krupp speaks in such a way that it appears to be obfuscating and convoluted, but it's actually telling you precisely what you need to know. And quite often the character who's receiving it doesn't get that because they don't have the full context that Krupp has. So Iskra Pus is kind of the opposite in the sense that where Krupp is insanely self-aware of the impact of everything he's saying and not saying, Iskra Pus is insanely unaware of the fact that there is no division between interiority and exteriority, right? So he's not aware that he's speaking out loud with his thoughts. And that just became a fun exercise in a writing exercise, in a sense, in terms of dialogue and character. Just basically to underscore that even in our everyday conversations, what we hear is only one half of what's really going on, and the other half can be in the exact opposite direction of what we're listening to. And Iskra Pus kind of reveals that, and that in turn becomes even more obfuscating in a sense because you don't know which way, you don't know which one's manipulating you.
Yeah, I couldn't decide by the end, and like this time the reread, whether he's a mad genius who gets exactly what he wants, or he's too foolish to even know that he's speaking out loud. But yeah, he's an inspired character. I love him.
Good.
Absolutely. The scene where the Bokurala start worshiping him is like one of the funniest scenes I've ever read. Like hats off to you, sir. Like that is hysterical. It gets me every time I read it. It's just peak comedy right there.
Well, at the same time, think about it this way: it's a fractal representation of maybe how some of the gods respond to being worshipped by mortal humans, right? Same levels of frustration and disbelief and all the rest.
Yeah, these shit throwing monkeys want something from me.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. That's how I feel when I go hang out with my nieces. So I get it.
You feel like a god?
Yeah. Get yourself some nieces, man.
Yeah.
I don't think it's up to me.
I
Sounds like a skill issue.
Yeah, their kids are pretty easy to entertain sometimes. So. Did anyone else have a question they wanted to ask. Otherwise, I guess we'll continue working our way down this.
I do.
Yes.
So on the topic of your writing process, I am very curious about how you work with feedback, beta readers, editors. I actually was lucky enough to work with AP. He was the developmental editor. Say that five times fast of my book, and he was amazing. And I also have a little writers group who do things like that, and I feel like I'm constantly changing the way I approach feedback and just project to project. And so I'm curious for you. You have this group of beta readers. You have your editor, or maybe editors plural. What is that process like for you, and how has it changed over the years?
I didn't really start acquiring advanced readers until at least halfway through the series, if not later. Yeah, before then, I mean, the only sort of feedback I would have gotten would be from my editor in the UK, because he was the first. And one of the sort of rules that I stipulated when I had the US editor plus the UK editor was that I was only going to do one revision. So I wasn't going to do two separate, get editorial feedback from two different people, because that was just going to confuse things beyond belief. It'd take a lot of time. So I just had the one editor, and I've been lucky enough to have that editor to this day. And so he was there for the entire 10 books. But later on in the series, I did make use of advanced readers. And yeah, very, very helpful, very useful. You still need to learn, I guess, a certain level of discrimination in terms of thinking in terms of what is that particular editor looking for, and bearing that in mind, that's going to have it's going to flavor their editing, their commentary, and their advice. And then you have to weigh whether what level of adherence do you want to apply to that particular advice. And if you have good reasons for not doing it, then those are valid, right? So certainly something like AP, I mean, his strength is narrative structure. He's just fantastic on that. And if you made some assumptions in your plot lines that have a knock-on effect, he'll catch that. And it's definitely worth, at that point, rethinking those opening scenes or those scenes that create that knock-on effect. So yeah, he's excellent for that kind of stuff. But it's not his job to catch typos, for example, or that kind of thing. So a lot of my editing I did myself. I do it on the page. So my process is what I wrote the day before is the first thing I read in my writing session for this day, and I do an edit as I read through, which kind of not only does it clean up what I'm looking at, but also it reminds me of sort of it pulls me back into the rhythm that I'd established the previous day, which then allows me to more seamlessly flow into the new writing, because that stuff I'm reminded of things, and that makes it a lot easier. So, and then that may happen multiple times, say in the writing of a chapter. I will have reread at least 2-3 times. I'll just go back to the beginning of the chapter before I pick up the next scene. And so there's a constant editing process that's going on as I go through it. And one of the things that's good about that, at least I find, is that it impinges the story deeper on you creatively, because you're getting more and more familiar with it, but not so familiar that you can't be objective anymore about it, and you sort of lose your your inbuilt shit detector and all that kind of stuff. So you don't want to be overwriting and rewriting and rereading constantly. Just enough to, that you're comfortable that all the sentences work. Your word choices are good. The rhythms are what you want. And you're sort of tied into the pacing that you're using, and how to manipulate that, with each scene. Particular details of characters that you want to sort of come back to and remind the reader of, that kind of stuff. These days, I'm back to no advanced readers. AP started teaching at a university with way too many courses, and so he didn't have time to be an advanced reader. So
That's cool. That's the going through what you wrote yesterday thing. That's exactly what I do too.
yeah,
I found
it's important.
so helpful. Yeah.
And Hemingway, this is one of his words of advice that I really stuck to. I heard it right at the beginning of my writing career was, don't write yourself into exhaustion on a session. Stop when the energy is still high. And his reasoning was, when you pick it up again the next day, it's going to be at that energy level. But if you write down into exhaustion, then your narrative's, the power behind the narrative is just going to do this, right? It's constantly going up and down because you've written yourself down and out, and then you have to rebuild for the next day. But if you're just cutting off when the energy's good, then you pick up where you left off. And that keeps it consistent.
That's great advice.
Doesn't it get boring rereading your own stuff? At least when I reread my own stuff, I get so bored because I'm like, I already know where this is going. So
I don't know where things
mistakes.
are going. I don't know where things are going in overall. I leave enough open for spontaneity and invention on the fly. No, it's more a case of applying almost a different kind of intellect to editing than you do to the creative process. They're two very different things. That's the editing side of things is all technical. It's all about craft and the things you can do to facilitate what it is you're trying to get across. So it's more clinical. It's more objective. And the creative side of things, that's completely different because there you can just fly with it. You can do. I'm gonna have to get a lozenge because my throat's getting dry. So give me a sec. I'll be right back. You can, I think, stare at a gargoyle. Is it there? There he is. So I've been writing a lot, and I'm hoping to get some time clear where I can sort of return to the book on writing. But yeah, there's a lot going on at the moment, for sure. I'll get to it. Don't worry. I got most of it done. I mean, a lot of it's all the essays I wrote that I put up on Facebook over the years. That's kind of the middle part of the body of the book. And the first part's pretty much written, and it's kind of a philosophical approach to writing. And then the last bit, some of the essays have examples like characterization, dialogue, that kind of stuff. But then I still have to write the last sort of concluding aspects of it, just how I'm going to wrap it up.
Very cool. Well, I can't wait. You have at least one reader.
Cool.
I have a question before I have to leave, unfortunately. I guess there's two assumptions to this question. One is that Malazan is your best work, and then two is that people will remember it a long time in the future. But how do you want people to remember like this series? What do you wish people would remember about it or think about when they think about it in, like, I don't know, 30 years or 40 years or something?
Well, I don't know. I'm hoping that it has it doesn't date itself. But I also know that so much of that is there's only so much you can sort of anticipate. I mean, language evolves constantly. Although if you think of something like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, it's had a pretty good shelf life, despite it being written in a particular style that is no longer popular. So sometimes the content alone is strong enough to draw readers in. That would be nice. But it's like I say, it's completely out of one's hands, and reader tastes, maybe the constant sort of growing pressure for shorter works, brevity, may eventually spell the end of the long and big fat books. I don't know. But even then, that's general trends, and there will always be people who will still find those old works. I don't know. I mean, it was everything I could do in terms of exploring the human condition. Everything I was capable of doing, for better or worse. And all I can do is just leave it out there and hope for the best.
Do you ever think about yourself in this, like, with the same people as, I don't know, like Tolkien or all those great, I guess, fancy writers or sci-fi or any sort of writers? How does it
No,
feel? No, you don't.
no, no. No, I don't. I mean, it's dangerous to start thinking legacy, anyways, right? It's uh, no, yeah, I don't find it a useful sort of direction of thinking. I don't go there.
Fair enough.
I think that's wise, probably, for your own sanity,
Yeah, you got to keep your feet on the ground. It's
Yeah.
and the writing process is so isolating. And even to this day, you would think after all these years, for me, anyways, that I wouldn't be plagued with doubts. That's just not the case. It's a constant battle. So, and the older I get, in a sense, the less my fuel tank runs dry quicker, and so I'm not doing my 4 hours a day like I used to. Usually, it's about 2 hours a day now, and I'm just having to accept that. That's sort of how it is. But I don't think it's weird because quite often I'll be, like I'm writing Walk in Shadow right now, and it's a big book. It's got a lot of story that has to be told. And I'm pretty disciplined on getting that done. But then I come home and through the course of an evening, for example, I'll start working on basically a novel I'm not supposed to be writing. It's entirely my own thing. It's sort of an epic space opera almost style, SF, with a lot of military attached to it. And I started it maybe 4 days ago, and I'm about 40 pages through already. It's just ripping along. And so, to me, in a sense, that's kind of my non-serious entertainment, rather than, I guess, watching television or at least watching television with the sound on. I'll often watch it with no sound, usually sports. I'll just sit there on the sofa and write. It's a weird, it's a weird pastime. It's a weird hobby, but it's been fun.
Have you
Definitely exciting. I'm a big fan of Rejoice.
All right, yeah.
have you read the books or watched the show Slow Horses? I just get
No.
the sense based off of your taste, what I gather of it, that you may like it. Very humorous. It's a spy thriller, but it does what a lot of your stuff does, which is it plays with the genre lovingly. It's about basically the rejects in MI5. They get tossed out into this like shitty job in Slough House, and they're called Slow Horses. And inevitably, every season / every book, they get dragged into an adventure, and it's
What?
brilliant.
Do you know what? Is it Netflix or is it
It's an Apple show. It's on Apple
Apple? Okay.
TV. And then the books are by Soho Press, I believe. I'm reading the third one right now. The show is what got me into reading the books, and they are phenomenal. And I just feel like the sense of humor might really work
Yeah.
for
No.
you.
I love British stuff, anyways, in general. So. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, that's a recommendation. Just
All right.
throwing that
Thank
your
you.
way.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So we've lost Dan. All right. This is on the chain of dogs. You never know who you're going to lose. Given that, let's take one of our questions.
That,
yeah. Do you want to ask
question.
it?
Sure. What was the narrative? What was the narrative intention behind the creation of the chain of dogs? I kind of looked at it as creating a mythology on the spot for the reader. That's kind of how I felt about it.
Yeah.
I didn't know if that was your intention, because I think it kind of resonates for the rest of the series as well.
Oh yeah, yeah. In fact, it resonates right up to the Witness trilogy I'm writing right now. The legacy of that is playing out. But you're right. I mean, it's I guess it's Anabasis in a sense, but it's also the Kabul retreat of the British Army, and various other, military disasters, if you will. But yes, it's very much myth making in on the page in front of you, and that's why there's a lot of sort of subtextual stuff that is pointing to, one of the primary, dare I call it myth making? I guess in a sense it is, but the rise of Christianity itself, and everything that was sort of surrounding that sort of flux, in the immediate aftermath of the crucifixion, where you have sort of mystery cults just sort of rising up and all kinds of
oh yeah, I see that. I see that.
Yeah, small groups and all the rest. And so in that sense, I want to go back to what would have been a particular moment for the Malazan world that would be similar in a sense, that it would spawn off all these belief systems. And I think there's a comment in No Life Forsaken, which is coming out in the fall, something along the lines of, if you were to talk to people in all throughout 7 cities, they were all there for the fall, right? They all witnessed it.
Yeah.
Of course, they didn't. So that idea is definitely playing around. And it's just I wanted it to be that kind of relentless chain that drags itself across that continent and across the novel, with links falling away as you go. So.
Yeah, but with Gardens, it seemed like the myths were already there for the reader to read about, whereas in here with Coltane, it seems like the myth was for the reader, rather than them already being there.
Yeah, I mean, Gardens was very in media res, right? So it's and its background is what Cam and I gamed. So in that sense, it was never intended to, at least initially, to be ever seen on the page. Cam is now sort of revisiting those places, which is pretty cool. But it was right for him to wait this long before he did that. And so I certainly applaud his mapping of which stories he was going to tell when. It's been really good.
When you were writing the Chain of Dogs and what would then come after it, you mentioned wanting to kind of explore that the in parallel sort of to the origins of Christianity, but were you also consciously or maybe unconsciously in dialogue with the narrative in Dune? Because I know you mentioned that was an inspiration for Gardens, at least.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Dune was structurally an inspiration. In other words, I took what I really liked, the way Dune was structured, particularly with the epigraphs and that kind of post-event analysis that we were seeing at the beginning of chapters and all that kind of stuff. I absolutely adored that. And it's very much an in media res novel. So it never even occurred to me that that was going to be in any way a barrier. But science fiction has a somewhat different audience than epic fantasy. So it became a bit more of a challenge for readers who are just versed in epic fantasy to get that in media res experience. But for the Chain of Dogs, no, I don't think. I mean, what made Dune really extraordinary was Herbert did not intend for the hero of the story to actually be the good guy, right? You know, he's writing against that kind of rise of fanatical worship, and that's what really made that interesting. And quite often, sometimes I suspect that a lot of readers, or at least viewers of the films, don't quite grasp that this is actually anti all of this, right? It's not in favor of all of this. Primarily because the visible bad guys they're seriously bad. It doesn't mean the good guys are good, but the bad guys are seriously bad, right? So it can pull the audience in that direction. But yeah, it's I read it as a grand warning, if you will, rather than anything else. So
absolutely, I do think that they were wise in making the sequel film, bringing kind of the this is kind of scary of it out a bit more, both with Lady Jessica and Paul. I mean, he's like dressed like a supervillain when he's going to give his speeches, and it's great. I love those movies. Love all the Dune books, even the really weird later ones.
Well, the last two movies have been terrific. Yeah, excellent.
All right, what else?
But yeah, I don't make. I can't think of any direct connection. I certainly wasn't thinking in terms of Dune or that storyline for the Chain of Dogs. I was drawing more from, I think, Anabasis more than anything else. So, but also the Kabul Retreat.
Yeah, but part of what I think makes it powerful for me was the fact that you used that we didn't get into Coltane's head at all, and so we're seeing him the same way that everybody else is seeing him. And I thought that was because you mentioned that earlier about him purposely not using him as a point of view, and as well, it worked. It had the same effect as with Rake as well.
Yeah, it was definitely a good call. I have to confess that on my first read through of Deadhouse Gates, the Chain of Dogs was actually the thing I struggled with the most, and particularly Coltane, that I just did not. I was struggling to like invest myself emotionally, and yet after revisiting it like something clicked for me, and it just all came together, and I felt the full emotional impact that I think lucky readers have on their first time through. Well, Felicien was the character I got like really into. That I was like really on her journey, feeling her pain. And then Icarium and Mappo, I would say as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, Coltane was never actually intended to be the one that you attach anything to. That's why he's kept at a distance, right? That's why he's kept not humanized, if you will, almost literally becoming legendary in front of your own eyes, right? So, and so it's the point of view of all the characters surrounding him that are elevating him to that level, and so your emotional attachment needs to be with them, right? It needs to be with Duiker and Bolt and Lull and all of these characters, and nil and nether, these characters. So, but at the same time, I can see how a reader who is coming at this and sort of anticipating sort of those sort of classic fantasy structures um, would attempt to adhere to Coltane as the hero of this particular story, right? I can see why that would happen. And of course, I was kind of trying to write against that, but sometimes sometimes the reader goes there anyways, right? So it's cool. I mean, you'll get a different experience if you were to read it a third time, right? Something else will come to the fore. I hope, anyways.
Can you elaborate on that you were trying to write against the like worship of Coltane that I feel like has extended like in the meta narrative of the book as well, that like people love Coltane.
Mm-hmm.
They love the Chain of Dogs. And it's like within, the fandom around your books, it's like there is this mini, this mystery cult arising, or that has arisen. And yet you say you were sort of writing away from that sort of emotional connection. Can you speak to that?
It's one of the, I think it's one of the characteristics of elevating any historical figure. It doesn't take long before you get. I mean, there's a whole pattern. There's a cyclical pattern to it. That kind of triumph of the will, kind of lifting up of the heroic character who's the leader of your country or whatever, right? At which point you can find that there's a kind of a worship that's building around this character, which in effect dehumanizes that character. And the more dehumanized the character a person gets, the fewer their options of actually being able to be human. It becomes more limited. Until eventually that character or that person, historical figure, ultimately gets taken down, because it does turn. Everything turns on this, right? So it's kind of, I guess, sort of a psychological inevitability that the heroes who are raised the highest are the ones who are pulled down the fastest. At some point. And that's what I was trying to write against. And that's why you had a cynical, burnt out historian is your primary point of view, because he's not going to buy that shit, right? And then there are scenes in the process of the Chain of Dogs that also are undercutting all of that. There's the demotion of the sapper, the marine, which really is one scene that was intended to, when you get Coltane turning away and Duiker sees that expression on his face, that's the human connection right there. But it's also recognized that Coltane is already self-aware enough to know that he cannot show that to anyone else. He cannot show that publicly, right? So he's already trapped by that point. And he gets further and further trapped the further it goes, until the inevitable consequence.
Excellent, thank you.
So I had a question about, let's say, there's always tension when you have prophecies and stories about free will, right? And I think Dune is a great example of how like prophecies can sort of lead to bad decisions. But in your books, I think you tend to use Deck of Dragons, and in this one, Felicin has some dreams that potentially foreshadow her later role as Shaik. So I was wondering how much you think about the characters' free choice, like continued free choice in their like when you foreshadow events for them, or when Felicin's case in particular, or in the end when we have the the pregnant woman who ends up like bearing Coltane, the reborn Coltane. It feels almost like the child is being prepared for Coltane, like this is going to happen. So how much do you think about the inevitability of that, like when it feels inevitable like that, do the characters still have choice, and like how do you explore or justify those
Well, that's a very heavy question. I can't really answer it because of spoilers. But those of you who are aware of what is the overall narrative frame of the 10 books should give you a sense that everything that is in these 10 books is deliberately chosen to be told in a certain way, which in a sense removes the option of free will from this narrative. It's just not there. Now, in a much broader sense, me as a writer, I think my answer 10 years ago would have been very different from my answer now. So, in terms of free will, and whether it actually exists or not. But for this particular narrative, for the roles that characters play in the Malazan stuff, I don't think free will applies. Let's put it that way.
Fair enough. Yeah. There was another scene, I think, in Gardens of the Moon, something I didn't know to think about during my first read through, when Tattersail is like the rebirth of Tattersail, right? When there's this sort of merging of time periods when a live Imas is talking to Krub, and Krub actually lets him know you're going to go through with this ritual. That gives a sense that they might be considering it. So there was also this maybe idea of how much did I forget, was it Pranchol?
Yeah, Pranchol.
His knowledge of the inevitability of this, that this is going to happen, influences, say, if he made a decision-making role in the conducting of the ritual. So like, there's a lot to think about in this. So I'm glad for the opportunity to think about it. If nothing else, it's a very rich series overall.
Yeah.
Just briefly, I want to toot your horn for a second to say that on this read, we really have been digging into the way you use symbols, and we kind of talked about this a little bit with Icarium, but in the first book, Gardens, the marionette, right, as this symbol of quite literally being played on strings, right, and cutting those strings, and the question of free will and divine intervention, and even the notion, kind of the meta narrative of Deus Ex Machina, and then into the second book with the Path of Hands, and the exploration of the savagery, the animal within humanity, and how it permeates through every storyline. And so you have the red swords are colored red, and then the whirlwind is also red, and it's all associated with the color red, right, which is obviously tied to blood and that sort of savagery, and it was sort of mind-blowing going through it and being like, oh my god, it's all there, like it's all connected, and so I just hats off to you, because that was definitely something I did not pick up on the first time, that like I can see, and very deliberately you picking these pieces and picking these symbols and interweaving them at every layer of the plot, right, and all the different subplots, and how they're all commenting on the same, within a book, the same sort of core themes.
It was really early on as a writing student. I was very fortunate in my instructors, and one of them, we talked a lot, actually, mostly in his office, about symbols, because it's a pretty important element of narrative structure, especially in short stories, because everything you put in there has to carry that extra weight, because you just don't have the length to spread things out. And I remember him telling me that the key for creating symbols is, one, they have to emerge organically from the story you're telling. You can't just throw them in there. You can't have a box of symbols and pick them out and throw them onto the
Right.
page, whenever you feel like it. So they have to emerge organically from the story, from the setting, and all the rest. And as long as you're true to that setting and true to the story, chances are those symbols will be sufficiently interwoven into your narrative that they will be internally consistent across the whole thing. Excuse me. And so once you think in those terms, then the only thing you're applying as you're writing is that radar to make sure that this symbol, if you're going to use it, first of all, you want to be subtle with it, but you also want to make sure that it does not thematically contradict anything else in terms of the other symbols that are carrying the subtext of the story. So, in that sense, it becomes kind of an overarching language that is running through your narrative. That it's there for the people who want to pick up the symbols, and they'll be able to jump from stone to stone to stone right across the river, just using those symbols. But it's not necessary, right? So that the reader can
Right.
follow through on the basic narrative and get everything you would desire out of the story. But for those people who want to do the extra or are compelled to do so, obsessively so, the symbols are there, right? They're all there, and you can start putting it all together. And I know quite recently a book came out that's a Jungian analysis of the Malazan Book of the Fallen.
That now.
All right,
It's
yeah, well,
excellent.
he goes into a lot of detail in that respect, and it was pleasing to find that it is consistent. But it's not consistent because I sat there with all these books by Carl Jung sitting beside me, right? It was consistent because of those early rules that I picked up on narrative structure and how to use symbols, and some psychology stuff and all that kind of stuff. But and so as a writer, especially a beginning writer, you want to learn to trust that. You want to trust your instincts in terms of when is it time to pull up from anything you've created, anything you've written. Can that have some symbolic meaning? Can you pull that through? Can you echo it with slight variations further on in the narrative? Can you return to it? And when you return to it, it should have fundamentally changed its nature, even though it be exactly the same symbol to begin with, because something has changed in the process of telling the story, hopefully, for the reader.
That's excellent.
So I'll give you an example. The opening scene of Deadhouse Gates is that figure who's just nothing but flies. Okay, so if you think in terms of symbols, well, flies are quite often symbolic of death or decay. Anyways, decay probably more than death in this case. And that particular, and then it comes up to Heboric and Felicin, and you're thinking it's a figure in flies. So it could be a god. It's supposed to represent a god, the godhood covered in flies, right? That's what the ritual is all about, which I describe, in the narrative. And so it says something to Heboric, and then it disperses, and there's no body. It's just the flies, which is telling Heboric in a sense that there's nothing at the core of this. There's, everything you're seeing, you're creating a kind of, I don't know, pareidolia in a sense that you've got this figure that's speaking to you, but at the core, there's absolutely nothing. So that's sort of opening symbol, which is kind of ominous, right? It's intended to be ominous. We return to it right at the last scenes of the entire novel, but we return to it in the sense of the pregnant woman on her knees and on the plains, about to basically abort her baby, because there is nothing within it. There's nothing at the core. Okay, similar to what we saw in the opening scene. But then she is startled away from that, and she looks up, and what she looks up in the distance appears to be a swarm of flies. Right? It's visually it's the equivalent in a sense. If I were to film this, I would make the camera angles, everything would be quite similar. But then as it comes closer, you realize it's not flies at all. It's crows, and they're carrying the soul to fill this. So symbolically, they're connected, right? They're wrapping around each other. But there's been a fundamental change because of the narrative to get us to that new scene that actually is a counter argument to the opening scene, complete counter argument. Does that give you an idea of what I'm talking about?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Is that opening, the fly guy, was he divers? This was something we were debating. Nope. Okay.
No, I just created it. I didn't sort of think in terms of the mythos of the world or the pantheon or all the rest. It's a manifestation. It could be from Hood. Hood could certainly have done that. But no, it's not Dippers.
Cool. Okay. And then what did we had the memory question. Someone had some question about memory. Can we cover that?
I can do that. Yeah, so Upsalar and Felicin are both possessed by, or I guess that's the right word, by gods at various points, and they both acquire the memories of the gods they possess, right? And definitely in the case of Upsalar, and perhaps in the case of Felicin, the memories they acquire change them as people too. So I was wondering how much and it feels like an exploration of the role of memory in the development of identity and personality. Were you actively exploring that, or did it happen organically because it was done so consistently? And
well, I mean, yeah, the two are a counterpoint to each other, right? One is, one heading in what could be considered the wrong direction, where this is the case of Felicin, who is eventually overwhelmed by the possessing goddess. And so her story is about the loss of agency when it comes to memories. Upsalar is the opposite. She's about the regaining of agency as she proceeds through the entire series. So again, it's you're kind of exploring the same thing, but you're offering two alternatives. There are two different ways you can go, but there's a multitude of ways to go. But for these two characters, they're on different paths for sure.
Another hard-hitting question: how old is Fiddler? We've had a lot of arguments about this. In the opening prologue, young Gano's parent thinks he's just a few years older than him, which would put him in his 20s ish,
right,
and he's just
okay.
aged poorly, or was that a mistake? We've gotten commenters telling us that we're wrong to think that he's maybe younger than he looks. What can you explain?
I would say generally certainly younger than he looks. As for Piran's point of view in the prologue, it's quite a few years before we see Fiddler again, isn't it? It's quite a few years. But, I mean, how does a child gauge the age of an adult? I mean, right? They're all over the place in that. It's very difficult to do. Ironically, the older you get, as from my point of view right now, I have a hell of a time gauging the age of anybody under 30, right? It's just flipped the other way, right? But a child just can't really do it. So he sees somebody with a beard, he thinks old, or possibly young, right? Doesn't know. But I don't think I intended him to be seen as particularly old, at least not physically. But there are also consequences to the bridge burners and their ascendancy, which comes later. So I don't want to really be pinned down on his age.
Sure.
I'm not, I don't, in a sense, I don't see its relevance. I know I saw somebody was commenting on Deadhouse Gates, and I think she expressed kind of a quasi creep out factor when Fiddler was eyeing or admiring Apsalar. I'm thinking, well, if he's in his 40s or 50s, what's he doing looking at this 18-year-old girl? And I thought, well, what am I going to do with that? I don't know what to say to that. No, I mean, Fiddler would not be particularly. No, he's not old. I mean, Whiskey Jack would be the oldest of the group for sure. Much older, at least 10 years older than Fiddler, I would say. That's probably as far as I can pin it down. It's just not really something I really thought about too much. You're writing a point of view of a character, and regardless of how they look on the outside, regardless of how many years they've lived, you can make them old inside or young inside.
Yeah.
Right? You've got that choice. Given the circumstances of what Fiddler has experienced up to that point, he's probably pretty old inside.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another way of answering it.
Personally think he is even more interesting if he is actually like relatively young, I mean, you're not like pinning a specific age on it or anything, but because I do think that speaks to what he's gone through, right? And who he is now over the course of the main Book of the Fallen. Well, I think it was Varsha who first brought that up, or someone, no, maybe it's Shannon. Someone brought up that in the prologue, the comment on Gano's comment on his age. And I just think that is such an interesting perspective, particularly because of the way young men and young women in this universe, historically, soldiers have to grow up fast, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they age fast and they change and they're not the same person, they were before. And I think it's an interesting commentary on war and soldiers and the way children or people who are barely not children anymore, but maybe not quite what we'd call adults, the horrors that are inflicted upon them and that they have to inflict.
Well, and the others, you can kind of flip that. I agree with you. You can flip it, though, in the sense of our modern sensibilities are actually a bit anomalous regarding the capability of people at certain age groups. Because historically, for the Malazan stuff, you're looking at Iron Age, technologically. So children are put to work historically in our world at a pretty young age at that time. So they're growing up a lot faster than children grow up now. You go further back to the Neolithic, and there was a huge, right at the beginning of the copper age, I think. It could have been flint even, but I think it was copper in Central Europe, mining industry that actually had was extreme. I mean, it's specialized, even though it was just like really, really early settlement patterns. But it seems to be specialized to this activity, and there's no question at all that all that deep tunnel mining was being conducted by children. So there are so many examples of that are quite contrary to our modern sensibility of what constitutes a child versus an adult. And so that's why I'm kind of being sort of evasive on this, because to me it's more a reflection of our sort of recency bias. It's that sense of the role children play. That's a product of this age, and you don't have to go back far to actually discover, children who are mining in the UK in the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah. On a similar note, were you consciously, something we commented on, kind of, darkly comically, and I think it is kind of treated darkly comically in Gardens. When you were writing this book, we were really kind of entering an era where, the idea of terrorism was changing the way, people, particularly in the West, viewed society and viewed the threats around them, right? And the bridge burners who are effectively our heroes, I feel, in book 1, are also given an act of what we might call terrorism to do. Was that very intentional? Like, was that, you were like, I want to challenge the audience with this, they're supposed to blow up a city street.
I don't think it was intentional in that sense. I'm sure I thought about it. But the storyline of the bridge burners infiltrating Darujistan was gamed. And the characters I played included Fiddler, Quick Ben, and Kalam. And the NPCs were Whiskey Jack, Mallet. Anybody else? Trots, maybe? Anyways, so we gamed that, the infiltration of Darujistan. And in the process of the game, we figured out, how are we going? We sort of want to sow chaos throughout the city. So how do you want to do that? And yeah, we stumbled on this idea of mining streets. And it was funny because I have a strong memory of both of us agreeing that is the stupidest thing you could possibly do in a city that's gas powered. But we thought, yeah, they're just going to go ahead and do it because it didn't occur to them. And then we riffed on that in the campaign. But there was a whole other campaign that was in Darujistan. And that was with characters that I rolled up, Krupp, Ralik, and Crocus wasn't a player character. Was never gamed. So yeah, Krupp and Ralik. I think another character named Ferret or something who didn't make it. But that was very much a riff on the Three Musketeers, and it was Cam was running that. I was running I think the other one. I may have been running it. We may have alternated in the other one. Anyways, so we had these two campaigns that were being narratively driven into a clash, and we would just be alternating between the two. And that's kind of what I wanted to sort of reflect in the novel. That you could pick either side, and we were as attached to either side, depending on the campaign we were in. So
cool, interesting.
And it was written long before the heavy sort of international terrorism. I mean,
right.
When did I write it? 91. 90. Yeah,
there you
90.
go. So yeah, that would be about it. Wow. Yeah. That's wild. Interesting. I guess that just goes to show as the decades have gone by, how that, history reframes, even stories written before then.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, do you...
That seems... Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we don't want to take up all your time.
Yeah.
I'm sort of getting talked out here, so yeah.
Do you want to speak at all to, you mentioned you're working on Walk in Shadow, do any publicity for yourself that you would like to do, or anything you'd want to share for anyone listening?
I'm nervous doing that because I don't know how long this is going to take. I'm about to head off for a month of just fairly intense writing retreat kind of thing. I'll be honest, I'm throwing some archaeology in there at the same time, so there'll be a few breaks. But by the end of the summer, I'll certainly know how close I am to either. I'll have either finished Walk in Shadow or I'll be close to it. But I don't want to announce anything quite yet. So.
Sure. And you had 2 Witness books are coming up, right?
Yeah, but it's traditional publishers, so expect one a year.
Right.
So yeah, I've received the copy edited version, gone through it, and sent it back. So I think the book's, at least in Canada here, it's going to be out end of October, beginning of November. I think we're doing a launch here at Monroe's Books, which is unusual. Haven't done that in many years. But the one that follows that, I would expect, a year after. I could be wrong. I don't know.
Very cool. And then the writing book is just, it's on the back burner for now while you're finishing up Walk in Shadow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And my secret science fiction novel that nobody's supposed to know about. So
that sounds awesome, by the way. I'm definitely there for that. I need to read your sci-fi stuff. Haven't gotten there yet.
We won't tell anyone.
Good. Glad to
our
hear.
lips are sealed. No one will hear about it. I promise.
Yeah. Right, then I think that's where we sign off. Mr. Erikson, thank you so much for coming to chat with us.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yeah. And we'll see everybody next week with the beginning of Memories of Ice. We're reading up to chapter 3. If you're following along with us, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you soon. Bye.